Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, episode 19A, an interview on Hayes, slavery, and civil rights with Dustin McLochlin. I'm excited to welcome Dustin McLochlin to the show today. Dustin is a historian at the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museums in Fremont, Ohio, where he's currently authoring a series of articles on Hayes' evolving views against slavery and on Reconstruction, which is where we'll focus most of our time today. Dustin, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Of course. Now, the first question I have to ask is it true that the grand prize of a Paraguay reality TV show was once an all-expense paid trip to the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museum in Fremont, Ohio? I read that in Atlas Obscura. I have to know if that's real.
Yeah, I feel like it's one of those funny stories that kind of changed and evolved over time. I actually it did happen. There was a girl who apparently was in a traffic accident in the late 90s. She was a 15-year-old girl, and there was a reality show there called Tell Me a Dream. And it was basically kind of like people who've been through traumatic instances like that, and then they get their wishes granted for them. What's funny about this story is her wish was simply to go to the U.S. And so in her mind, she's going to New York City or somewhere like that. And then what happened is they being Paraguay and Hayes being somewhat of a hero there, they kind of turned it also into a trip for her to see one of their heroes. And so she ended up in Fremont, Ohio instead of New York City, which I'm sure probably upset her a little bit, but she did get a tour in the late 90s. Yeah, she was here.
I mean, every little girl's dream, the President Hayes Presidential Library. I must hear more about Hayes in Paraguay. Have you been down there? How legit is Hayes mania in Paraguay?
Yeah, I've not been. There is still a recognition of Hayes from the political leaders there. We do get usually the ambassador of the United States from Paraguay tends to make a trip here. We've met multiple ambassadors. However, you get the impression from some articles that I've read and some people I've talked to that it really doesn't really seep down into the younger generations who see Hayes and they know that there's a school and a city and all these regions named after him, but it's just a name. It happened so long ago. They're not really concerned about some old fogey who made a decision, well before they were born. But yeah, it's still a big deal for those in the political circles in Paraguay.
All right, so that is one of my most delightful things in this podcast. I have discovered the connection between one of our presidents and Paraguay. Yeah. Okay, so next question, more to what I actually said we're going to talk about today, getting to civil rights and Reconstruction, the topic at hand. I'd love to start actually at the end of Reconstruction, kind of at the end of the story, because it's one of the most pressing questions on my mind. Hayes is often pinned as the president who ended Reconstruction by withdrawing federal troops from the South, which was part of a deal for Southern Democrats to accept his election. But by the time he's sworn in, only 2 Southern states even have federal troops in them still. So I'm curious, do you think it's fair and accurate to say that Hayes ended Reconstruction?
Yeah, this is obviously this is one of the most common ways that Hayes will pop up in popular media, especially in 2020 when there was a lot of infighting over the results. And I believe and Ted Cruz there at the towards the counting of the votes started saying we should have an electoral commission, and he uses 1876 as an example of this electoral commission, these group of guys who were going to look at the returns and determine the actual winner. So there is this connection that popular media, popular historians kind of connect between this end of Reconstruction that you bring up and this supposed corrupt election. And what most historians who study this moment in particular point out is that these two events occur, but they're not necessarily connected. And it feels like in the popular history, we kind of connect these two things because there were debates between some of Hayes's Ohio guys and
Yeah,
some and some Democrats, Southern Democrats, because after the Electoral Commission had determined that Hayes was the winner, and again, that's a whole other story. I'm not sure if you want
totally.
to go into, but there was a lot of partisanship and weird things that occurred to make that decision. But after the decision was made and the Electoral Commission ruled and Congress was working to verify, a group of Democrats had this idea to basically forestall the results indefinitely. And maybe, through that, it could be thrown into Congress where they held more members and maybe they would get Tilden put in. So there were debates about that, and there were meetings to work around that. But what most historians feel is that the Democratic regulars, the leaders, were not interested in that. They were interested in moving on. And so they actually voted down the potential filibuster.
Yeah.
So then the question is what was the point of those meetings? It's always kind of goes to this meeting at the Lumley Hotel.
Yes.
Where again, Hayes's Ohio guys meet with these southern men.
You're really making these Ohio guys sound shady.
Well, it's the best way. In a way, it's the best way to put it. Because they are Republicans. Hayes never would get involved in this stuff. Not because I'm not saying he's somehow above all of it, but simply that was the era where both Tilden and Hayes refused to get into the dirt of this political fighting because it would stain their reputation. So it was Hayes's close friends or political friends, and they happen to be from Ohio, which is why who meet with these guys. And there's a lot of theories on what this argument, these debates could have been. The most compelling, I think, is from a historian. His name was Michael S. Benedict, who basically argues Hayes is real interested in civil service reform, and he's wanting to try to become president with as little arguments and little fighting as possible. Because if there's all of this Republican fighting and Democratic fighting, his reform agenda may not come through because he's going to have to rely on these Republicans who Grant ended up relying upon, who were the spoiled men.
Yeah.
And so that's, to me, the most compelling argument, but that doesn't really answer the question you're asking, which is Reconstruction and Hayes and Reconstruction. Yeah. And the answer to me is, if we're talking about the last vestiges of federal attempts through troop placements to uphold Republican governments in the South, then the answer is yes. There were two that were left, like you mentioned, South Carolina, Louisiana, and he had made the decision that era needed to end, and there needed to be a new era of Reconstruction, if you will. But the way we've seemed to define Reconstruction with the troop placement, he actually ordered the troops that were around the Capitol buildings to return to their barracks. And when he did that, that was the symbolic end to that. But as you identify, there were only two states left, and Grant, who multiple times throughout his presidency attempted to continue Reconstruction by the end of it, he was realizing that the public was no longer on his side. There was a lot of backlash every time he used it. There weren't the option of military engagement for the purposes of Reconstruction had really lost public support. And Hayes, in a way, was completing the work that had already begun well before he was even nominated for the presidency. So, but the answer is yes. I'm not trying to backtrack about that. He is the guy who ended the last vestiges of that moment.
So it's like, sure, true, he ended it, but it also kind of feels like when I was a kid and I find a tray of Oreos and there's two left and I eat them and I get blamed for eating all the Oreos. It feels a little unfair. Do you think
the previous director of the museum here always he always said it that it's kind of like if there were you're down by a lot of runs in a baseball game and you're the last batter up and you strike out, somehow
Yes.
you're blamed for the entire game's loss,
Yeah.
So there is some truth to that.
So I'd love to dive deeper into the moment in the decision, especially why didn't Hayes put up a bigger fight to continue Reconstruction? Why did he go ahead and yield and say, okay, this is over?
Yeah, well, the kind of like what I was leading into at the end of that last answer is that
Mhm.
the public had really moved away from it. Constant uh, defunding of the military.
Mm,
As Southern Democrats are becoming more and more a part of Congress, they're being readmitted into the Union. And when they're readmitted into the Union, they get all their representatives back, all their senators, and through oppressive, means in the South are preventing newly freed Black men from voting. So
hmm
you're getting this Southern white contingency in Congress that is defunding the military.
hmm
You've got once a Democratic governor becomes the governor of that state, he is not going to play ball with Washington anymore, which is the requirement of our Constitution. And so there is this really the game is too hard to play at that point. And in Hayes's mind, his hope is to move into a new element of Reconstruction. And I think this is where we can look at Hayes and be like, oh man, how naive can you possibly
Yeah.
because his thought was, well, if we end this military occupation, then people will naturally stop fighting in the South, right? You won't have white men trying to keep Black men from voting because they only see Black men as Republicans. And if they're not just Republicans, if they're men just like them who may or may not vote for the Democrats or the Republicans, they're
Yeah.
not going to be oppressed. They're not going to be held back from the polls.
Yeah.
He also believed that there were enough old Southern Whigs from the Whig Party,
Oh,
before the
wow.
Republicans came out. He
Yeah.
believed there were enough of those guys who would, once the issue of race was settled, they would start to see the Republicans' view when it comes to economics and civil service reform and all these other issues that they normally voted with Republicans on, and the hold of the Democratic Party would loosen in the South. Uh, I think it feels incredibly naive from a modern standpoint because the racism was too deep. The
Yeah.
the political Democratic Party was too entrenched.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess you got two things you could think of in my mind. You can say, man, that guy was naive. I can't believe he even thought of that idea. Or two, you can say he was playing the best hand he had available to
Sure.
him.
Sure.
But one or the other, obviously after Reconstruction ends, this is slow march towards continual, laws in the South that would end up being things like Jim Crow laws.
And
And then it
actually,
wouldn't be until 1950s and 60s when you start to see.
yeah, actually, I was going to ask about that. What was the impact of withdrawal? And you kind of just answered this. How quickly does Jim Crow set in the South once the feds are gone?
Yeah, it's hard. It's one of those things. It's hard to sort of pinpoint the aha moment when Jim Crow comes in. Obviously, when we talk about Plessy v. Ferguson, that happens in the 1890s. That's when it's sort of codified this idea of separate but equal.
Hmm
But these types of um, attacks on civil rights in the South
hmm
are increasingly growing. Once Democratic governors had controls of the states, once Congress realized that the federal government, or once the states realized that the federal government was not going to be infringing or they had no mechanism to uphold any of their civil rights acts or any
Yeah.
sort of civil rights in general.
Yeah.
It was just a slow march to absolute, repression or oppression.
Do you get the sense that Hayes regretted this decision later in life, that he wished he had fought harder or kept the troops down there or done anything differently?
Um, I think he, well, here's something that he said. At the end of his presidency, he was looking back on it and his decision, and he said that my judgment was that the time had come to put an end to bayonet rule. My task was to wipe out the color line, to abolish sectionalism, to end the war and bring peace. And then he finishes, I was ready to resort to unusual measures and to risk my own standing and reputation with my party and the country. So he seemed to have this idea that this was a gambit, and he was putting his reputation on the line to hopefully make this gambit come through. But I think here he is writing it in the last full year of his presidency, and he's saying in a not so obvious way, I guess here, he's saying it failed. And so I think there is this regret that the outcome was not what he thought it would be. Um, but I don't, but I really feel like that's one of the few indications we have of it. He did still have a lot of support from Southern Black men. You know, they were the ones who were able to vote at the time.
Sure, sure.
And so I think there was still uh, the rawness of what would come later. I guess that Jim Crow that would come a little bit later hadn't quite sunk in on him quite yet what it was leading to. So maybe there wasn't the straight outright regret that you might want to see from someone, right? That made such a consequential decision.
So that's, we talked a lot about kind of the end of the story of Hayes and civil rights and Reconstruction. Let's go back to the beginning. You've been writing, I mentioned earlier, a series of articles about Hayes and anti-slavery and abolitionists and all that. And you write about how Hayes was raised by an uncle who was an anti-abolitionist. So what were Hayes' early views on slavery, and when did they start to mature and change, and why?
Yeah. Well, early views, he really embraces what his uncle, his name was Sardis. His Rutherford's dad died a few months before Rutherford was born. Mm-hmm. So he was raised by his mom and his mom's younger brother. His name was Sardis. And Sardis was a Whig. Now, the family had come from Vermont, and they had traveled and settled in Ohio before Rutherford was born. Mm-hmm. And so that's important to the story because Vermont is in the area that is the most sort of abolitionist, right? They have that strongest background of that movement. And so Hayes has his uncle who was raising him, Sardis, who came to Ohio at a youngish age. He was a teenager, and he takes on the Whig Party, but he takes it on in a way that is also anti-abolitionist. And he has this other uncle who he writes about so fondly in Vermont still. His name was Austin, did I say Sardis? Sardis was anti-abolitionist. Austin was an abolitionist.
Yeah, I think you got that right.
Okay, I got that right. And so, but he's raised by Sardis, and he loves Austin, but those views really seep into Rutherford. And he goes, he grows up that way. When he visits Vermont, his Vermont family tells him, they were talking about the school he was going to, and they say, we want to send one of your cousins there too. And then Rutherford basically tells him there are no abolitionists at this school. Oh. And and then the Vermont family was like, well, then never mind. We're not And then Hayes writes back to Sardis and basically makes fun of them for the way they feel about abolitionism. So, so Rutherford definitely has taken on this anti-abolitionist feeling that Sardis has. Later on, to answer your question, maybe there is no real moment that I've pinpointed yet where the light flicks on for Hayes and he becomes an abolitionist. Well, I would never say that he becomes an abolitionist. That has a different connotation to it.
It does.
But he definitely becomes anti-slavery by the 1850s. And I don't know the moment that clicks on, but I believe that once he moves to Cincinnati and he starts rubbing shoulders with famous abolitionists, he joins a literary club there. They're talking a lot intellectually about the political moments at the time. And you see an evolution in the way he's writing about this. And it slowly gets to the point to where he's not only writing in favor of ending slavery, but he's also defending slaves or fugitive slaves in the courts.
Yeah.
And I think there's a combination of his move to Cincinnati and the people he's around, but it's also the fact that this is that moment, the 1850s, after the fugitive slave, 1850 fugitive slave law, when the North is starting to identify politically with ending slavery. And so Hayes, in a lot of ways, is following into the trends of what the Republican Party is doing as well.
Awesome. And you started getting into the area that I wanted to talk about next, and that's this time in Cincinnati where he's starting to represent some fugitive slaves. It's the time of the Fugitive Slave Act, which basically that makes it easier for Southerners to come up and get their slaves back. What got him into that in particular? Like, do we know what led to him starting to represent these escaped slaves, and do we know how many he represented?
We know for a fact. Well, it depends on who you ask. If you want,
Yeah, it was depending on who I was reading, a month ago. So, yeah.
Well, if you ask Rutherford B. Hayes, if we could bring him back to life and ask him, at the end of his life, he was being interviewed and said that there came to his knowledge about 40 cases, and he said that he defended 30 to 40 fugitive slaves in some way in his time in Cincinnati. He then says that only three or four of the cases came to the ears of the public. But from our historical record looking back, there's only evidence of two.
Oh, okay.
So, there's a good chance a lot of it didn't make it in the newspapers, which that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So he may be right, 30 to 40. He may be, but what we can go on are the two that he actually did. He actually defended, and those happened in 1853 and 1855.
Okay.
So shortly after, within 3 to 4 years of moving to Cincinnati, he's gone from anti-abolitionist to defending slaves. So something happens there in those 3 to 4 years to where he's made that switch. And I don't know what it is. Again, like I said, there's that interacting with his literary club members. He's interacting with Salmon Chase. He actually writes that Salmon Chase was boring. So he doesn't particularly like Salmon Chase, but he likes he likes what he stands for. He talks about Levi Coffin. He actually says that he never went to bed without expecting to be called out by Levi Coffin, who was a abolitionist there in Cincinnati. He beats Cassius Clay from Kentucky. He actually helps defend a slave with a guy named James Burney, who was this famous ex-slave holder who moves to the North and becomes an abolitionist. So it's the people he's around, from what I can tell, and they're convincing him of this course, and he's following it.
So we know of 2 cases in the historic record. How do you do on those? Did he win? Is he 2-0? Is he 0-2?
Well, you know what? I'm going to say 1-0, 1-0, and 1. There's like this weird. I'm going to start with the one that he won first, even though it's chronologically out of order. But the one that he won involved a girl named Rosetta Armstead, who was a girl who was being transported to Wheeling, Virginia at the time. And normally that would require a ride along the Ohio River, but it was winter and the river was frozen. So they took him across, and the slave owner's proxy, so not the actual slave owner, but somebody had moved, he makes the decision, well, the river's frozen. I'm going to take this nonstop train ride from Cincinnati to Wheeling. And if the train doesn't stop, nothing's going to happen. Well, after he makes that decision, he finds out the train is going to stop. And so he gets off in Columbus because he knows people there. So he was going to take Rosetta to these people's house, keep her quiet, keep it safe, right? and then once the train, get her back on the train, go to Wheeling, and no one would know. Well, word did get out, and a group of Black women actually start to surround the house and get the police officers involved, and they have her removed from the home. And number of court cases. She's brought into court there in Columbus, and they determined that she should be free, because when the proxy brought her over, that was an act of freeing her.
Wow.
So she was let go. She was put in the custody of a man. His name was Van Slyke. She was in the custody of this guy. And then the slave owner wasn't happy with that, so he actually goes back and tries to capture her. A number of things happen, but they end up taking her, moving her the south. Van Slyke realizes that she'd been kidnapped, and he actually contacts his people in Cincinnati and said, don't let her get into Kentucky, get her off the train before they get there.
Yeah.
And they do that. And so in Cincinnati, she goes before the court again. And once again, the court says that she's free. And then, I don't want to get into the muck of the Fugitive Slave Act, but U.S. Marshals are required to make this happen. Right. So the U.S. Marshal actually, after she's ruled free, still takes her, and it's at this moment where marshals could actually ask for basically citizen posses to protect him.
Yes.
And he stands out and he says, "You must protect me because I got to take her to the South," even though she'd been freed twice by courts.
Wow.
So it goes before the U.S. commission, the commissioners, the commissioners who are the ones who are supposed to determine, I guess, supposed to in quotes, determine whether or not she's free or not.
Right.
And that's where Hayes gets involved. So
Got
they
it.
go before the commissioner. Actually, it's Sam and Chase, it's Hayes, and they once again defend Rosetta.
Yeah.
And Van Slyke makes this comment: if it wasn't for Hayes's closing argument, she wouldn't have gone free. Sounds like a cool thing. Most likely Van Slyke was just happy that it worked out in his favor.
Totally.
She had already been freed twice before. It was very likely she would have been freed again. But that was the final nail in the coffin. She was let go, and Hayes was a part of the team that accomplished that. The other one's a little bit. That one's fun in a modern looking back standpoint, right?
Well, yeah, I love the part about the woman surrounding the house and freeing their fellow. That's amazing.
Yeah, what is it? It was the proxy. I forget his name now. That's why I keep calling him proxy. But he I think he wrote down that these women were like birds of ill omen surrounding the home. So but. A very compelling story. And the other instance was this slave. His name was Lewis, and this actually happens 2 years before Rosetta. He fled Kentucky before the fugitive slave law the 1850 fugitive slave law was enacted, and he made his way into Ohio, and had been there for a long time. 3 or 4 years before he was finally caught. And his case goes before the court as well, and it's and James Burney and Rutherford Hayes are the ones defending him. And Hayes is doing a lot of weird things to keep the court people keep the judge from determining the outcome. Some of it's based on these laws of this ideas of positive law and the idea that you can't be a slave unless that state says you're a slave. And he's in Ohio, and we don't see it here. He's asking for Kentucky laws because he's like, well, Kentucky is that a slave state or a free state? He's kind of acting dumb. Like, is that slave or free? We need the laws to determine whether Kentucky's a slave state or not. They're getting these and every time there was trying to bring evidence, and he's basically saying no, unless it's positively stated that this is a slave state, she's free, or he's free. This is Lewis.
Yeah, he's free.
And so he's making all of these arguments, and finally the judge asks both teams to come to the front. And they're leaning in and they're talking to each other to have a discussion. We don't know what they're discussing, but they're discussing Lewis's case, and the Supreme Court justice was trying to get involved, Judge McLean, who was on circuit there. And so when they were discussing, Lewis, through the encouragement of the crowd, starts to push his chair backwards. And supposedly one of the people in the front row took his hat off and put it on Lewis's head, who was then further encouraged. And he made his way out through the crowd and out the back door while they were discussing. And so he had jumped in a stagecoach or a wagon or whatever, and was taken off. He was gone before the marshal recognized it. And the marshal's screaming, "Lewis, he's gone, he escaped!" And they're going and running out for it. And apparently this courtroom was packed with free black people who are just smiling, and they're not going to give up. Where Lewis And Lewis made his way. Actually, he stayed there for a while everyone was on it. This is supposedly he stayed there in Cincinnati for a while all this was going on. And they had sent the Underground Railroad network of people had sent reports to all these newspapers that Lewis had escaped into Canada and he was already gone. So you can go back through the newspaper records and find like the Buffalo paper saying, "Oh, the same Lewis slave escaped into Canada." And it's not true. He's still in Cincinnati. So all of these people think that he had already escaped. And then after all of that had died down, then they took him up and out. So, there was no ruling. We don't know if Hayes would have won that case or not, but Lewis took it into his own hands.
I like how this ends with kind of the Die Hard plot. They're not going to catch you if they think you're already gone, And this is the first time I get to reference Die Hard on the podcast, so I feel like this was a job well done. Okay, so one of the other things, first, thanks for those two fantastic stories.
Yeah.
Kind of similar to how, depending what I was reading or who you're listening to, you see different numbers, how many people are represented. I also see different claims about how involved he might have been in the Underground Railroad. Was he involved or an ally of the Underground Railroad, from what you can tell?
Yeah, this is all going to come down from what he's saying as a guy in the last year of his life. He's being interviewed often about this stuff, and he makes these claims that not only was he, he says that his services would be offered freely to the Underground Railroad when needed. Levi Coffin being one of the directors and officers who would ask him for help. He claims that he saved slaves from the reverse Underground Railroad, or free black people from the reverse Underground Railroad, from being put into slavery. He claims that as well. No evidence other than his claims, so it's just whether or not you want to take him for his word or not.
I'll give him credit. Sure, why not? We've talked about how he becomes a lawyer. He starts defending a couple slaves. He starts getting more into this anti-slavery movement. What else does he do as a private citizen in the 1850s to get involved in civil rights? Is there anything else he does? Really, not, I guess, say anytime between then and his presidency. So in Congress also.
Yeah. I think that's maybe one of the more frustrating, might not be the word, but I think we have this desire from when reading about these men in the past that they're going to be a little more of a firebrand, right? A little more vocal, a little bit more in your face about their views. And Hayes just is never that, even in the things he's really passionate about, like civil service reform, there's always this tempered sort of approach to it. And I think the same frustration kind of happens here. He is defending fugitive slaves. He is rubbing shoulders with these guys, and you start to see some fire in him. It does happen a little bit once the Civil War breaks out, and he joins. And one of my favorite quotes from him is a quote where he was under the leadership of General Cox, and General Cox received a letter from General Garfield, who would go on to be the president after Hayes, right? Mm-hmm. And basically, General Garfield is saying that that the war is more to there's more blame to be going on guys like General Sherman because of their inability to see the actual reasons for the war being slavery. And Hayes says he knows that this is the reason for the war. He writes, time and the progress of events are solving all the questions arising on slavery in a way that is consistent with the eternal principles of justice. Slavery is getting death blows. As an institution, it perishes in this war. It will take years to get rid of, but the debris will take forever. He says, we are at the same high call here today, freedom for all. We all know that this is the essence of the contest. So he's making these strong claims of slavery being the purpose of the war.
Yeah.
Well before the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yeah.
Before these moments when people are still debating whether this is a desire to save the Union or whether this is truly about slavery. And Hayes makes a very strong stance that this war is about slavery and slavery needs to end. Part of his argument, of course, is humanitarian. There were a number of what were called contraband slaves who would come across. And he, through the direction, a lot honestly, of his wife, Lucy, refuses to do anything that would send these men who had escaped back into the South. And he would keep them with him in his regiment, use them for their knowledge, or he would send them up north. He actually sent some up, supposedly, to his uncle Sardis, of all people, who, while he sort of went into the same political evolution that Hayes went through never really could slay the demon of racism in his own life. So, but Hayes still sent contrabands up to his place, hopefully that Sardis would give them employment or something to do. When the war is winding down, he was nominated for Congress. And when he gets to Congress, he actually becomes an ally to the radical Republicans, guys like Thaddeus Stevens and Sumner, and he supports this in his voting record. He actually goes to the South and surveys the Freedmen's Bureau, says that he actually writes a friend and says, you need to let me know if I'm getting too deep into this, because I feel that I'm in deep basically with these radical Republicans.
Yeah.
So much so that when he's running for the governor position for his first term, he runs explicitly on a radical Republican plank.
That's bold.
So he's doing this on black voting rights in Ohio, and this was still something to debate, and just absolutely identifies himself with that part of the Republican Party. I will say that changes as time goes by. But at this moment, if you're asking about where Hayes had that fire of civil rights in him, I would say 1860s. It's definitely there.
So what about as when he's a president, and then after the White House, as a private citizen, what does he do for civil rights in these stages of his life?
Yeah, the moment of civil rights as a presidency, I do think that this is a missed opportunity for him. He was a president who believed firmly that if anything was going to be passed into law, it needed to have some sort of enforcement mechanism, and there wasn't any enforcement mechanisms for this. One of the big moments where you see him swing his bat hard for civil rights is this moment when the Southern members of the Congress, the Democratic Congress, are trying to add riders to an Army appropriations bill to prevent troops being used to monitor polls for federal elections. And Hayes vetoes these bills one after the other. And Democrats keep throwing them at him, and he keeps throwing them back until finally he gets the bill without the objectionable rider. And it was seemed to be this huge success, not only for civil rights, but for Hayes's presidency. But there is more to the story than that, to be honest. He does identify this with a proper, perhaps, civil rights action, but he actually writes more fervently about how Congress is trying to usurp the powers of the presidency here. So there is also this fight between Congress and the executive and where powers lie for things like this. And so there is that element as well. But as far as civil rights, I'll be honest, outside of that Reconstruction moment and his desire, basically he was a guy who believed a lot in moral suasion. And he thought—
Wait, what? Moral what?
He didn't believe that laws were going to be the way to move forward with civil rights in the South. You could only do it by proper example and through the uplifting of men in the South through education, white and black men.
Yeah.
So his mind was more on the nebulous sort of ideas of how do we help everyone become educated so that these basically ignorant views on racism could be educated out of these people, right? And again, maybe naive, maybe grand, I don't know, but
yeah, very aspirational and hopeful, and naive is kind of what it all sounds like.
Yeah.
So you've been diving a lot into Hayes, this evolution on civil rights and anti-slavery. I'm curious if you were to rank presidents on lifetime body of work, what they did for civil rights, where would you rank Hayes and why?
Man. Yeah, this is a hard one. Not very highly. I'll be honest. He's in this dead zone of civil rights activity here.
Yeah.
Honestly, he kind of is the first of a line of presidents who simply just don't it doesn't even seem to enter into the equation of their consideration on a lot of things they're doing.
Yeah.
And that's kind of sad. But I guess I would put him in the bottom half. There are obviously a lot of examples of presidents who did overtly negative things, right?
Yeah.
For civil rights in the South. I would put him above those guys.
Yeah.
But if we're looking for positive examples, I don't know what we can really point to.
He's just kind of like a net zero guy.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. Now, some people would argue and say, well, he's not net zero because of his Reconstruction policy. And maybe that's true. I think that requires a little bit of investigation into what his options were at this point, what he could have really have done to turn this thing around and move it back the other direction. But I will say, it's not, if we want to take it in context and we want to put it in the context of that particular moment, there were Republicans who still wanted to fight, who still wanted to uphold Reconstruction. So put it in the time, we can say that he didn't side with those guys.
Yeah.
And so we can put some negative points in his direction in this. And so, yeah, maybe there is, I wouldn't say net zero. I would say he's in the negative, but not deep in the red.
Oh, come on, Rutherford. All right, I got just two last questions for you. First, what lessons in leadership do you think we can learn from President Hayes?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I probably feel a little insignificant to make too many conclusions, but I do think that, I guess one of the big bones, I guess, I have to pick with some of the way that we look at the presidency is we seem to really enjoy the individuals who are pushing hard for certain agendas, using the bully pulpit.
Yeah.
Going with guys like Teddy Roosevelt, who was just really out there and pushing things forward. And, Hayes wasn't one of those guys. So leadership, from what I'm assuming, and I've not done, this is pure assumption, that we really value that type of leadership. In which case I would say that maybe we don't want to learn something from him in that way, but I think that we can learn that there is something to a soft approach, someone who isn't attempting to push his or her ego above those of others, who's willing to take it back. I mean, he never engaged with negative press. He refused to. He let it go. If you're talking about the first couple of years of his presidency, when he was called things like Rutherford fraud and his fraud. Matter of fact, Rutherford fraud comes from the Republican Party. It was his own party who called him that. So so that's a hard pill to swallow. And so there is this. I think if we're going to learn something from his leadership, maybe it's the fact that even though he was dealt such a difficult first couple of years, he kept his head down, he kept working. And by the end, he did have a lot of people who supported him running for a second term. When he was nominated, he said he only wanted one term, and that was it. And he stuck by it. But I think there's something to say that at this moment, when we'd had Republican after Republican after Republican, this was a moment where we could see a Democrat take over. And, maybe through some of the way people viewed his presidency, they passed some of that on to Garfield, who was elected president next.
Yeah.
So I think if we're looking at it from a leadership standpoint of someone who's going to ignore all of the emotion and all of the ups and downs and stay steady and even, I think that's what we can pull from him.
Awesome. And so the last question I have for you, and this is something kind of that we touched on at the top of the show. When Hayes was elected, half the country thought he had actually lost the election and thought he was an illegitimate president, which sounds kind of familiar. We are living again at a time when a not insignificant percent of the country thinks the current president was elected fraudulently. What can we learn from Hayes about how to effectively lead when your legitimacy is questioned?
Wow. I mean, you can't go out. I don't know. I think I would lean back. I think I would lean back on the, here's what I'll do. I think I'll answer I think I'll lean back on the previous idea of trying not to engage too much, but I think to give a little bit something different to this question, what I would point to is the way, if we're talking about 2020,
sure,
and we see a desire to a perceived desire to maybe not care less about the actual workings of how our system works and more interest in whether or not I had won or not, and putting it all into question based on what I think the outcome should be, not what on the system has created. I think we can look at, I know that was a very vague way to try to say something, but hopefully, but I think what we can pull from Hayes and Tilden both is that when all of this controversy was going on, both guys felt they had won. If you read their personal stuff, both of them are saying, I won this contest. Hayes has his reasons, Tilden has his reasons, but they never put it out there in the public in a way to try to undermine people's confidence in the process of determining the winner. Moving forward, they both seem to think and act as if democracy and the Constitution were more important than their personal ambitions. And I think regardless of what the outcome of that election would have been, both men would have done what Tilden did and ignore the people who asked him to go to Washington anyway, to take the oath of office. They would fight, with war. He would fight, violently to see him nominated. If the shoe were on the other foot, Hayes would have done the same thing.
Yeah.
So I think that's the element that we can learn from this election versus 2020.
Got it. So no tips for leading when everyone thinks you're a loser. But good advice for just accepting when you lose.
Well, I think that's the advice. I think that's what we learn from these guys is that when you can't thrash back against the negative feelings that people have towards you, because you're not going to actually change their minds.
Yeah.
The only way you can change minds is through the steadily moving forward with what you think is right and hoping people come along to see it the same way.
I like that. That sounds like a good kernel of advice right there. Here we go. Cool. If you'd like to hear more from Dustin, please check out his recent series of articles on Hayes' evolving views on slavery and Reconstruction on the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museum's website. And then you can also give the Hayes Library a visit in Fremont, Ohio. If I'm ever in Fremont, I will. Thank you so much for your time, Dustin.
Thank you for having me. It was great.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, tell your friends about the show, and leave a 5-star review on your podcast listening platform of choice. It's always good to hear from y'all. You can also follow the show on Facebook at Abridged Presidential Histories or on Twitter at APH Podcast. If you'd like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon or go directly to www.patreon.com/Abridged Presidential Histories. This helps me buy books and pay to host the show. And thank you everyone who has contributed so far. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Olgar Fife and Drum Corps. In our next episode, we'll look at the life and presidency of James Garfield, a man who's going to pick up the reformist mantle and go toe-to-toe with Lord Roscoe and his henchman, Chet Arthur. That's next time on Abridged Presidential Histories.